All right, so welcome, guys. This is going to start our talk off. I'm Peter Blum from Pivotal. I'm a platform architect. I work with customers. And one of the reason that I made this talk with CredHub was because we have so many customers that are using PCF, on the operations side and on the application development side. And they always have questions around security, right? And all their database passwords and credentials are inside of the platform and inside of their applications and how they're being secured. So that's sort of my story of how I'm here. And this is Scott.
I'm Scott Frederick. I'm on the Spring engineering team, and I've been doing some work with integrating service brokers into CredHub. I work on Spring Cloud Services, which is a Pivotal product with Pivotal Cloud Foundry. That's my full-time job. And then I manage a couple other small Spring projects on the side and a new project we'll talk about today.
Cool. All right, so we've got a little agenda here. We're just going to go through sort of the why and what of CredHub, and then just some basic use cases. So we've got about 30 minutes, so we're going to speed on through. So first off, we'll start with CredHub and why did we choose to build CredHub. We have Dan here, who's the PM for CredHub. So he really put a lot of this stuff together, but I'm just rehashing it. So basically, there's really, if you start looking at credentials, there's three core pieces to credentials that I'll cover. And the first piece is configuring credentials. So configuring credentials is really difficult for a multitude of reasons. On the operations side, you have multiple of systems, and keeping all those credentials in one place, making sure that they get rotated and making sure that they're always secure is difficult. Here's some basic headlines that I pulled, and I'll just highlight Equifax. I think we all know about that, but what I didn't actually know until I read the article was that they were actually using admin for a username and password that was keeping something secure that had about 12 million people and their social security number underneath that. So then underneath there, we have, after you've gotten it configured, oftentimes what ends up happening is credentials will leak, right? And we have to understand that they're going to leak. No matter how well we set it up, it's going to happen. And whether that's, we're moving so fast and we mistakenly commit a AWS key to GitHub, right? That's one of the worst things. And then tomorrow you wake up with $1 million AWS bill. Different things can happen, and here's some more headlines around that, right? I think we've all used Uber. Maybe your credentials, there have been leaked, and so maybe you've actually lost some data there. And finally, once those credentials get leaked, there's a lot of time that passes by, right? So you may never have known that for 6 months, somebody's been in your system actually hacking in and pulling all this data, and then they, 14 years down the road, they actually go ahead and release all that data, right? So I'm originally a Boston-born kid, and I was really surprised at this hospital in Massachusetts that didn't know there was actually a compromised data for 14 years. And that was pretty incredible. So if you really look at this, there's three goals, right? Making credential configuration easier. We all know that credentials are going to leak, so being able to conquer that somehow, and then being able to minimize the time, right? And so CredHub really comes in to eliminate all that. And so CredHub's general goals are to become a centralized point for credential generation, storage, rotation, logging, and access control. So it's a lot of different points there, but I think the whole overarching goal here is that CredHub should be your one place that you store credentials, and you get credentials, and you share credentials inside your company. So if we look at who are the users of CredHub, you can really define this in two different user groups. There's three different ways to interact with CredHub. There is through Bosch, which I'll jump into a little bit. So that's sort of on the operations side. There's actually a CredHub CLI, which you can grab on GitHub. And then there is a REST API, the specs out online as well. And so if we group those up, we've got really two different groups, right? We've got an operations-focused group that would interface with CredHub, and then there's a developer group that would focus on CredHub. We're going to focus mostly on the Spring and developer portion. I will get a little bit into the operations here. So what's underneath CredHub? Well, underneath CredHub, if you have all those ways of interacting with CredHub and pulling credentials and storing credentials, underneath there, CredHub needs to store them somehow. So of course, it uses a SQL database. And we don't want to just store them as clear text credentials. So what we do is we actually encrypt those credentials on the way in. And there's a nice little pluggable interface there, so you can add your own HSM or something. And then all the credentials inside of CredHub are role-based, they're all role-based credentials. So essentially what that means is I can say that I'm an admin and I have all access to all the credentials, or I have access to only my dev org space or whatever I should have access to, and I can adjust that based on the needs, my ever-evolving needs in my team. And so there's a few different credential types. I'm not going to read these out, but you can see here they cover most of everything that you would need to cover. And so these can all be generated on demand with CredHub, or you can specify your own and have CredHub encrypt them and store them for you. There is a link there to grab more information about each credential type. And then here's a little bit about the REST API. So the REST API is secured via MTLS or using OAuth 2 with UAA. And basically, it's just a cred, right? You can create, delete, whatever you need on the credentials. And then you can also set permissions on those credentials. And there's also a REST API endpoint for interpolating. So what that really means is sending essentially the value, right? So you're gonna send out the key, and what we're gonna get back is the actual value that corresponds with that key, right? So you could think like the key could be something like password, and then the value might be your actual password. So there's an interpolate endpoint as well.
This endpoint is a pretty interesting one, and we'll get into that a little more towards the end.
Yeah. You want to pick up on this one, Scott?
Yeah, so this is the little Spring project that I was alluding to a while ago. This is a brand new Spring project that just provides a nice Java mapping on top of the CredHub REST API. So instead of having to negotiate that REST API yourself, you can just use this library, pass Java objects in, get Java objects out. A couple of nice things that it does is, Peter mentioned that the two ways to authenticate with CredHub is either via mutual TLS or OAuth. If you have a Spring app that uses Spring CredHub and it's running on Cloud Foundry with the Java build pack, then the mutual TLS negotiation is done for you automatically. So that makes it really fast and easy to be able to get to CredHub. It also supports OAuth 2. So a 1.0 release of Spring CredHub will be coming very soon. It really probably would have been there already, except we need to write some user docs, which is like twice as hard to do as actually writing the code. So as soon as we get some user docs out there, we'll publish this thing as a 1.0.0 release, and you can start using it in a Cloud Foundry that includes CredHub.
Cool. Yeah, this is the Spring magic around CredHub, right? It makes it easy for your developers to interface with CredHub without even really thinking about it. And so now if we actually jump over, so now you should have a base understanding of what CredHub is. Let's take a look at actually how to use CredHub. And so first, what we'll start with is sort of the operations side of the house. If anybody knows me, I love Bosch. I think that's my tagline, so I'm going to start with Bosch. So what you can see here is that now if you have a Bosch deployment manifest, you'll actually go ahead and add this new section called variables. And inside of that section, you can see, I don't know if it's big enough, but what you can see there is that we're generating a certificate, right? So there's no more using the OpenSSL CLI to create you a certificate. You can actually specify common names that the certificate should be part of. And so you send this manifest with the variables inside of it into Bosch and say, deploy me something, right, using that CA. And what Bosch will do is it will go out and it will ask CredHub to generate a credential, right? And so in this case, that credential will be a CA. And so CredHub will generate that, encrypt it, and store it in a database. And then what it will do is it will return that credential back to Bosch, and Bosch will use that credential to deploy a service, right? And so now I actually have a deployed service with a credential that is stored in CredHub. And so what are the real benefits that you're seeing there? Well, what you're seeing is that your manifests are simplified dramatically, right? It's quite obvious what this CA cert is for now. I don't know exactly what the CA looks like, but I know what it's for. I know what common names it's created for. And so it really simplifies the manifest. And then after that, you're also enabling access for your whole operations team to Bosch. Because now, if you only have one person that's supposed to know what the CA certs are, you can have him and the other guys look at the manifest without actually seeing the certs. And also, it enables you to take these manifests and commit them to Git, right? Because your certs, your passwords, your usernames, everything is not stored in the manifest anymore. All that's stored inside of this manifest is a simple key, essentially. So it's pointing to the actual credential that you want to grab from CredHub. So when is this available? Well, it's already available for you now. So it was available starting in Bosch 262 on GitHub. In 262, Bosch introduced something called the config server, config service. And that config service, the only one really supported at this point is CredHub. So since then, Bosch has created that sort of abstraction, and CredHub is plugged in. And ever since PCF 111, CredHub is deployed now with Bosch, actually on the Bosch Director VM. So you'll actually see that if you ever go into the Ops Manager VM, you'll actually see that there's a CredHub service running on there with Bosch. And then we'll switch over here and focus more on the service binding credentials.
Okay. Yeah, so that was the first big use case for CredHub, is storing Bosch secrets. So now we're going to talk about the second big use case for CredHub, which has to do with the binding credentials from service brokers. So first, we're just going to do a little bit of a recap of what service brokers do and how the platform interacts with service brokers. So if you see at the top here with Cloud Foundry, you can do CF create service, tell it what the service is you want to create. And then there's this interaction between a cloud controller and a service broker through the Open Service Broker API, where the service broker will be asked to create an instance of a given service, and it'll return those details back to cloud controller. Then the second step is you bind that service that you created to an application. And in this case, the cloud controller makes another call to the service broker, which is part of the Open Service Broker API, and says, create a binding. What most service brokers do in the case of creating a binding is just generate some credentials that is the information that an application would need to connect to the service. So in this example, down in the bottom corner here, you can see this little bit of JSON, which is this credentials hash. That's typically the sort of thing a service broker would return back to Cloud Controller. It may be a JDBC URL if it's a database. It may be about anything. In this example, we're just using a simple case of a URL with basic authentication, a username and a password. So that's kind of service broker and service binding 101 there. And then once that service binding is in place, there's lots of ways that you can see what those credentials are. One of the most common ways is you can do a CFENV on that application that the service is bound to. And you'll see this big block of JSON that contains information about all the services this app is bound to. So again, in this example, this application is just bound to this one service. And along with some other information about the service that's been redacted here for brevity, you would see the credentials for that service. So this is the way Cloud Foundry has worked for a long time. And for a long time, there's been some concern about how easy it is to see these credentials from some of the more security-conscious users of Cloud Foundry. So some of the places where these binding credentials end up living is inside of Cloud Controller. When you create the service binding, Cloud Controller is going to store those credentials. They are encrypted at rest in the Cloud Controller database, but they do live there. There are a few Cloud Controller REST API endpoints you can hit to get the app environment, which is basically what the CFENV command does, or to get details on the service binding. If you make either of those REST calls, you'll see those raw credentials coming back. When you stage an application that includes these bindings, all that environment, the VCAP application, VCAP services, some other stuff gets stored in that droplet. If you CF SSH into an application container, you can also see that CF or that VCAP services environment variable. And then, of course, in the actual process memory of the running process, you can see them. So these credentials are kind of visible in lots of different places throughout the whole Cloud Foundry system. So this is the problem that the CredHub integration with service brokers is trying to solve, is how can we reduce this visibility to where all these credentials can be seen inside of Cloud Foundry. So here's the way things will be able to work in the future in a Cloud Foundry platform that includes CredHub. So we're going to review the binding workflow again. So when you do the CF bind service, Cloud Controller will call the service broker to create the binding. The service broker can still generate the credentials. But now the service broker can store this credentials hash in CredHub. We saw earlier on one of the slides that one of the credential types that CredHub supports is JSON, which is just kind of an arbitrary JSON object that you can ask CredHub to store. That's really the primary use case for that credential type, is these service binding credentials. So the service broker can store those credentials in CredHub, and then what it returns to Cloud Controller is just is a credentials hash that just contains one item, which is this CredHub reference, CredHub ref for short. So there's this bit of a convention that we've come up with, which is for the name of the credential, which is just the name of the service broker, the instance GUI ID that Cloud Controller gives you, the service binding GUI ID that Cloud Controller gives you, and then just the name of the credential. So that makes it easy inside of CredHub to find these service binding credentials. So now that this is in place, since all the Cloud Controller gets back is just the single CredHub reference, if you were, for example, to do CFE&V on that application, this is what you'd see is a single CredHub ref. You can't see those raw credentials in this scenario anymore. So that it gives a lot more security to the visibility of those credentials. So now, how does an application actually work if all it sees is these CredHub references? Well, that's where this CredHub endpoint called interpolate comes into play. And it's a really pretty fancy endpoint that gets pretty far away from the typical CRUD type of operations. So you can take an entire VCAP services payload, which may include multiple service bindings. So in this case, we're just showing one to make it fit on a slide. But you could have multiple service bindings, each with their own credentials block and each with a CredHub ref in there. And when you pass it to that CredHub interpolate endpoint, CredHub will walk that structure looking for any CredHub refs in that structure, resolve them to those raw credentials, and return you a new block of JSON that has all those CredHub refs resolved. So as long as you have the right authentication and authorization to be able to do that, this interpolate endpoint does really all that hard work. Peter mentioned that when you store credentials, you can assign permissions to credentials, so you can control who has this ability to do this interpolation through the authorization. So with that CredHub interpolation, one of the modes that you can configure Cloud Foundry in is what we're calling assisted credential resolution. So here, we'll walk through this flow at a really high level of what happens when you deploy an application. So you tell Cloud Controller you want to CF push an application. A part of what Cloud Controller does then is go and accumulate all these service bindings and other information and build the VCAP application environment, build the VCAP services environment, and other things that it wants to tell the app about how it should run. Passes all that down to Diego. Now before Diego launches this application, Diego is going to make that call to CredHub to say interpolate this VCAP services that may have CredHub references in it. So Diego will get back the interpolated VCAP services, and when Diego sets up that environment for that application, it will have the raw credentials just in that process environment. So with this assisted mode, applications don't have to change because by the time applications are launched, they will see the raw VCAP services, even though if you do CFE&V, you see the CredHub references. So there's some really nice Diego launcher magic going on to make this whole thing basically invisible to applications by the time they run. So in this assisted mode, if we go back to where credentials are stored, credentials are still stored in the Cloud Controller database, but the credentials will just include that CredHub ref and nothing else. So yeah.
So while creating backups, how would you inform that you need to use CredHub?
Yeah, good question. So if you're doing a user-provided service, is the question, instead of using a service broker, how would this work? So in that case, you would, when you create a user-provided service, you're providing that whole credentials block. So you can take that credentials block, use the CredHub CLI or the CredHub REST API yourself, and store those in CredHub just the way a service broker would, using one of those REST API endpoints. And then when you actually run the CF cups command, you would provide just that CredHub reference. And at that point, Cloud Controller doesn't know if that came from a service broker or from a user-provided service. It just sees credentials with a CredHub ref in it. So the part of storing it is what you'd be doing manually, either using the CredHub CLI or the REST API, and everything else would be the same.
If you
No, you can't use Ops Manager. You'd have to get a hold of the address for CredHub running inside the platform and use the CredHub CLI to talk to it directly. And sorry? I didn't hear the question still, sorry.
The question is, can you cups do it for you? Why do I need to know with
Yeah, there could be a CF CLI plugin that could be written to do that for you. That would certainly be an easy enough thing to do. That hasn't been done so far as I know, but a CF CLI command could certainly be written to do that.
Hi, Colin Jackson. I'm the PM on CredHub. CredHub's being released in 2.0, this particular flow, and experimenting. So I have no doubt that we're going to teach cups how to handle this flow, but this is an ongoing process.
Yeah, we are fortunate to have the current PM and the former PM of CredHub in the audience, so, and I'm glad they're not afraid to stand up and answer questions. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So let's try to get through the rest of this real quick here. So with this assisted mode, again, the benefits are the Cloud Controller database just has these CredHub refs, not raw credentials. So if you hit these Cloud Controller REST endpoints to get the application environment or get the service binding details, you're also only going to get CredHub refs in the credential blocks. Same for stage application droplets. And actually, if you CF SSH into an application container, the environment that you're going to see in that scenario is going to have VCAP services with just the CredHub refs, because you're not actually in the application process memory at that point. So even CF SSH will hide these credentials for you. That was actually a little bit of a surprise to both of us when we were testing some of this. So then that was assisted mode. Then you can also configure Cloud Foundry in non-assisted mode, which means you're really just telling Cloud Foundry, Cloud Controller, and Diego, don't mess with these credentials at all, which means your application is going to get the VCAP services block with these CredHub refs, and your application is going to have to know how to grab that CredHub ref and do the interpolation all on its own. This gets a little bit difficult because you've got a lot of different languages that applications can be written in, and you're now having to teach applications that CredHub exists and what its address is and how to authenticate with it, and to go call this interpolate endpoint. So this is certainly possible, but this isn't kind of the default way Cloud Foundry is going to work, at least in the beginning. For Spring applications, we are prototyping. If you're using a Spring application with Spring Cloud connectors, or you're writing a Spring Boot application and you're using the VCAP.services properties like you see here, which Boot provides you, we are prototyping some ways that Spring apps will get that interpolation done automatically for them as well. And I believe the Steel Toe group is working on some .NET solutions along those lines. But basically for every language and runtime that can run on Cloud Foundry, there's going to need to be a solution for how this non-assisted works. But the assisted is pretty secure, so I think that's really going to solve the issue for most users. Yeah?
At what level is that set? So is that a Diego level setting, or is that something at an application setting?
Yeah, that's in the, if you're rolling your own Cloud Foundry open source, that would be part of the Diego deployment manifest, that you would tell the Diego launcher either to do that or don't do that. And Colin can give you lots more details on exactly what the YAML looks like to do that, if you care that much.
And so if you're not using a service broker, just jump back here. So this kind of leads back to that cups idea, right? So if you're not using a service broker when you use cups, you're not using a service broker. So when you're not using a service broker, this is what you're going to have to do inside of your application, right? So there will be no interpolation done for you when your container comes up. So you're going to have to do that yourself as well.
So this non-assisted mode, the additional benefits it gives over the assisted mode is, like I said, even if you CF SSH into an application container, you would see the CredHub references in the VCAP services. But it is possible with that assisted mode to go a couple levels deeper with Bosch and with Garden and actually get an SSH into that application process. And with assisted mode, you could still see the raw credentials there as with non-assisted mode. Even if you're SSHing into that application process, you're only going to see the CredHub refs and the credentials, and because the application is actually doing that interpolation in its own memory. Okay. So this is a question that was kind of up a minute ago. If you're deploying open source Cloud Foundry using CF deployment, the CredHub bits have been a part of CF deployment since version 0.36.0. But there's a lot of stuff you have to do to set up CredHub and tell Diego how to talk to it and tell Cloud Controller how to talk to it and all that. Starting in Pivotal CF 2.0, CredHub will be available in the pass tile. Most people probably have heard by now that Elastic Runtime tile is being named to the pass tile, so that'll be, CredHub integration will be a part of that pass tile starting in PCF 2.0 with this assisted mode. Now, every service broker that you might want to use is going to need modification so it knows to store its credentials in CredHub as a part of the binding process. So the service brokers will come on a little bit afterwards with their CredHub integration. I can tell you that Spring Cloud Services, because that's a product I work on, in its next release 1.5, which will be roughly concurrent with PCF 2.0, it will support CredHub integration in that version. And I know that the Pivotal, RabbitMQ, and MySQL, and all the other tiles that Pivotal manages that are based on the on-demand broker, they're all in progress with this CredHub integration also. I don't know what their release timelines will be, but hopefully they'll be following on PCF 2.0 pretty quickly. Okay, and that's, we saved 3 minutes.
Yeah, we want to give them a pitch.
Yeah.
So as we were saying, that all the service brokers need to be updated, right, to actually put all the credentials inside of CredHub. So this is a little pitch for a later on session with Matthew to actually figure out how to build service brokers. And so if you don't know how to build it, all these service brokers are going to need some overhauling. So check out that session to help rebuild some of these service brokers. You want to do the demo, or you want to
Let's do some
questions?
show and tell. We had a little show and tell in our back pocket just in case we had time. So that's the end of our slides, but we can go in and actually show some of the stuff that we were talking about.
Yeah. So if we take a look here, we've got a fortune teller service running, which is a really simple service. It's there's a UI and then there's a service. So the UI connects to the service to just pull a fortune to show us. So I can just show you that here. So this is the UI, and the service underneath just gives us a fortune.
So this application is using Spring Cloud Services, and this is running on PCF 2.0, a beta release of that, a pre-release version of PCF 2.0. It's also running a Spring Cloud Services tile that's a pre-release that has the CredHub integration in it. So we've created 3 services here from Spring Cloud Services that are all CredHub enabled.
Should be able to see that in there. Yep. So now if we actually go into the app and we take a look here for actually look into the application environment, and we take a look at the actual environment, you'll be able to see here that these are the actual CredHub references, right? So these are no longer, specific CredHub, specific parameters that you'd actually see. They're all CredHub references. And so if we had the CredHub CLI and everything installed, we'd actually be able to go and connect to that and show you the actual credentials. But the great thing about it is we can actually go, since this is a Spring actuator, we can go to the environment variable. And so you can actually see that the Spring application is actually going out to CredHub and
Bigger?
Make it bigger. There we go. Is that better?
JSON's hard enough to read even when it's big.
Here, you want to go through it?
Yeah, so let's do this real quick. Are we still SSH'd in here?
Yep.
So if I do CFE&V on this app, the same thing that Peter was showing in the CFSSH. So this is just normal CFE&V output. We'll see VCAP services for the pconfig server, which comes from Spring Cloud Services, and it's just got a CredHub ref and the credentials. MySQL isn't CredHub enabled yet, so it's got the raw credentials. And then the SCS service registry has a CredHub ref, and okay, that's all that's bound to here. So then what Peter was showing here is once we're in the actual application memory, if we find the service registry, I always wish these were sorted to make them easier to find. Let's find the config server.
You just go, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, so here, for example, is the config server credentials client secret. That's one of the things that actually comes back in the credentials block for the config server. It should have a URL, an OAuth client ID, an OAuth client secret, and an access token URL. So we'll see all of those things in here. There's the config server client secret, the service registry client secret. The Spring Boot actuator is actually masking those values because it knows they're sensitive. But if we find the, yeah, these things are hard to find in here. So anyway,
Yeah.
that just kind of shows that CFENV is hiding those credentials, but inside of the application memory, they're magically being resolved so that this fortune teller application is a sample app we use with SCS all the time. This application had no modifications to work in this environment. We just CF pushed it straight from a GitHub clone, and it just works because of all the assisted mode that's going on in Cloud Foundry.
Yeah.
Is there can we install CredHub standalone? And yes, is there a
Yeah, CredHub is just an application that can run. It's, like I said, it's in the CF deployment, so there's a Bosch manifest for how to deploy it along with CF deployment, but there's nothing stopping you from just running a CredHub server completely on your own. It's open source. If you're doing that, you're basically running from the open source repository, and all the bits are right there. There's a CredHub server, and then there's a CredHub Bosch release. So you could go find both of those in open source and have fun with it. And call Colin if you have any questions.
Sure. Any other questions? Sure. So authentication's handled through mutual TLS, right, and UAA, I think, is what so in PCF, I think we're just supporting UAA for 2.0, right?
Yeah, you can authenticate with OAuth 2, and CredHub knows about UAA and knows to use it as a resource server for OAuth 2.
Yeah.
So CredHub is yet another credential manager. Are there any plans on the roadmap to integrate it or provide interfaces for existing enterprise-capable credential systems like Benify?
I don't think so.
I don't like seeing that head shaking.
Well, I mean, there's always, with open source Bosch, like Peter said, Bosch has introduced this abstraction layer that's a config server, and CredHub is the first implementation of that. I wouldn't be surprised if there's other implementations of Bosch config servers that can talk to other sort of credential managers. So from a Bosch open source perspective, I think that'll be open. From a Cloud Foundry perspective and how all these different parts of Cloud Foundry, like the Diego launcher and everything, are integrating, there's no plans to use alternatives for that. I think that's why Colin was shaking his head, yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. The real primary motivation, the long-term motivation for why we're building, the long-term motivation for why we're building a CredHub is to centralize the location of credentials across the platform to make progress on the rotation R of the 3 R's that you probably heard of, rotate, repair, and mutate, more aggressive security strategy rather than a proactive one. Rather than a reactive one, a proactive strategy. So we are focused right now entirely on the Cloud Foundry use cases to basically improve that experience. It's not something that I would rule out at all. I don't think. I think that you're not the first person to ask about integration with systems that would be more broadly applicable across data center or multiple data centers. But our primary goal right now is just to meet the use cases today. Credentials that we are being entrusted with. However they get to us are, I can talk to you later.
Yeah,
Sure, in the back.
So in the Bosch YAML files, if we are using the Cooper Cloud Foundry, they stop, so they won't let us change the YAML stack. How many use it if I want to use it on my own? How do I
So I think what you're asking is, I think you're meshing these two together, right? I think you should think of them separately. Bosch deployments, it's not something that a developer would usually be doing. That's something more of an operational side.
from an operational perspective?
So from an operational perspective, I guess I don't really understand what you're asking. If you don't have manifests, then how are you deploying ever? How are you in operations?
So the Cloud Foundry manifest for the app.
Yep.
Right, Ops Manager generates the Bosch manifest in that scenario, right?
Right. So that's been there since PCF 111. That's been generated for us.
Right. So we have one level and perhaps someone uses its own credentials. But how we define it, we have a file that has the and we want it to that file as well.
Hey, let's take it offline. You and I can we'll catch up. Let's chat after. Perfect.
Yeah,
All right.
along with PCF 2.0, there will be new documentation that will give some explanation of how service brokers and tiles can find where CredHub is and talk to it and all of that. So I think that might be part of your answer, but.
Perfect. Cool. All right. Yeah, we'll be outside. So if you guys want to catch up, we can do that as well.
Thank you.